Bibles again to Galatians 1. And let's read again verse 13 through verse 23. It's actually through verse 24. Through the end of the chapter, we'll read this again together. But before we do, take that Bible, if you would, hold it up with me and say along with me, this is the Word of God. I will read it, I will believe it, and I will obey it by the grace of God. I mentioned last week my plan, because we've been talking in these first words as we go verse by verse through the book of Galatians. We had kind of said that the first several verses and the last several verses of this chapter kind of went together as Paul is telling the story, and he's reminding really that people in the region of Galatia, the Christians, the churches that were there in the area of Galatia, of who he was. Now, the ones when he went and started the church there in Galatia, and churches in Galatia, they knew who he was, but there would have been new people coming in, but then also we talked about false teachers that were coming in and were accusing Paul of not having the authority that he did, and so therefore Paul is telling them of his story and his call to be an apostle and a minister of Christ. And so this is the first, we're calling it first words, because again, the book of Galatians is most likely, or at least one of the earliest written books of the New Testament. And again, we mentioned how it was written before the Gospels, written before the book of Acts, written before, not chronologic time-wise as far as the events happening, but in the order of the writing, it was one of the first, if not the first, book ever written. And certainly the first book written by Paul. And so I had thought that, okay, I've kind of covered that, and so we're going to begin in chapter 2. But as I was reading and praying, I saw another message the Lord would have me share here. I think one that would be helpful to us, and that is the broken road. The broken road that Paul took to becoming Paul the missionary. Saul took to becoming Paul the missionary, if you will. Saul the Pharisee to Paul the missionary. In 1994, before, Alex, when were you born? 97. So before your time. I was going to say, before some of your time, I know it was before Ella and Lucas, but before Alex even, there was a song that was made famous by the band Rascal Flatts. You don't often hear the preacher get up and talk about country music, but it was a song called Bless the Broken Road. And it was largely a love song. It's sung at probably a lot of different weddings and different things, but it was about an individual who sets out looking for the love of his life, but he finds a twisting, bumpy, broken journey that eventually, through the events of his life, led him to the love of his life. That's what the song's about. And it's really about how life doesn't often go as smoothly or the way that you think it will. And thus, in comparison, or similarly, is the life of Paul. Or the story of the Pharisee, like I said before, named Saul, who traveled the twists and turns of life for a time and lost his physical vision on the road to Damascus, then had his vision restored as he converted to Christianity and the name Paul. And so he lost his physical vision to gain some spiritual vision and became the greatest missionary the world has ever known. But it was a broken road, and I want to share some of that with you. This broken road that he was on, that although the song's about meeting the love of your physical life, he met the love of his spiritual life, his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and he devoted the rest of his life to that love, serving Jesus. And although he began by pursuing advancement of his own desire in Judaism and as a Pharisee and in religion, he became about relationship. And his journey didn't end as a Pharisee or in religion or in brokenness and lostness, but it ended in being found by that amazing grace that God called Paul to salvation and to the ministry. Now, if you want to go back and you want to read largely about some of what we're covering today, and then we're going to make some application from that, you can find it in the book of Acts. The book of Acts, we first meet Paul in Acts chapter 7, and through chapter 9 kind of covers the conversion, the beginning of Saul, where he's at the stoning of Stephen, the first martyr, and he's the one that holds the coats, consenting to, and he's kind of the authority over that. And then we read on where he is persecuting the church and breathing out slaughter and killing and imprisoning and persecuting those that were of the way or followers of Jesus. And then picks up also in chapter 13 through 28, which largely covers the ministry of Paul on his missionary journeys leading to his own imprisonment, physical imprisonment, and his eventual death. The journey God has for you and for me, to our eyes, often appears broken. And as we read the story of Paul, it often appears broken. But we also can take the verse and what all things work together to those who love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. And we see that what we often see as a broken road is God artfully and masterfully leading you to where He wants you and where you need to be. And He has a way of doing that we don't often understand, but yet He does it. And so I want you to see several things this morning, and really I'm going to kind of recount this broken road of Saul who became Paul, and then I want to apply it to your life, and I'm hoping by the end of this you'll see some things and make some connections that even I made this week. I tell you this often. There are certain things that I think every Christian knows, and I sometimes assume that every Christian knows, and I sometimes make the assumption incorrectly, or they need reminding. Maybe you did learn it, but you've forgotten or need refreshed in your memory, or maybe you never learned it at all, and that's okay because not everybody learns things the same way, the same pace, but I try to not assume that people know something. So if I cover something, you say, well, of course I know that. I'm glad, but I don't want to assume you do. At the same time, I'm often embarrassed that I didn't realize something. And there were some things in this message and in my study of Paul and in Galatians that I didn't make the connection on that now blows my mind. And I don't know if it'll have the same effect on you, but I'm going to point it out to you anyway. And I hope that it helps us. So I want you to see, number one, this morning, the journey to salvation and ministry and service of God in Jesus Christ are rarely straight or smooth. Now, we talk about the path to righteousness being a narrow one and being straight, and then wide is the gate that leads to destruction. But our journey through this Christian life is rarely smooth, or our journey to Christ, and then even our journey after we are encountered and saved by Christ is rarely a smooth or straight one. Although sometimes I think we get the idea that it's supposed to be, but it's not. And so I point to you, in these verses, we see Saul, who is now Paul, but he's kind of recounting his story. And we talk about how he had been called of God, and it wasn't by any man or church or anything else, but he was actually supernaturally trained by Jesus in Arabia. We'll come back to that in a moment. But when we picked up in verse 13, he's recounting his time of persecution, and he's recounting his time leading up to where he was at teaching or starting the church at Galatia. And he's kind of giving them his story, if you will, his testimony, if you will. And we talked a little about that a couple weeks ago, but I want you to see these things. This journey to salvation is rarely straight and smooth. It is often broken, and we start with Saul, the persecutor. Saul, who became Paul. And so if I say Paul, you understand. If I say Saul, I'm referring to the same person. But he was Saul in chapter 7 of Acts when he was persecuting the church. We first hear of this Saul in chapter 7, verse 58. We see him holding the coats of those that would stone Stephen, and he was there and responsible for the stoning of Stephen. And at this point, Saul is most likely in his early 30s. Now, that's important because I'm going to point something out in a little bit that I think we probably know, and I think that I knew, but I don't often think about, and when you do, it kind of opens a different door of understanding in some things. And so Saul is there in Acts 7, and then in chapter 8 we see that he's continuing to pursue and persecute the we'll call Christians. They weren't called Christians yet. They were those of the way, those followers of Jesus Christ, those who were not following Judaism, which is what Paul was practicing and zealous about. But he's persecuting those of the early church, taking them to prison, having them killed, and that's what he was doing. And then that's where he's at in his early 30s. And then in Acts chapter 9, he's talking about this now, where he meets Jesus. So we see in verse 13 and 14, he's talking about the fact that he was more zealous than those around him, and he had escalated up the ladder of the Pharisees. Later we hear him talk about being a Pharisee of the Pharisees, but he was a big deal even in the Pharisees. Usually Pharisees were not young men, but he was already climbing the corporate ladder of the religion, if you will, and he was a somebody in the religion. But then he becomes Paul, and that happens on the road to Damascus. And in Acts chapter 9, he's encountered, and most of us are familiar where he's on his way to Damascus to haul off those that were of the early church or those that were of the way and take them back to prison or have them persecuted and face death sentences and so forth and so on. But then there's a light, and Jesus speaks to him, and he is struck blind. He falls down. He's then told to go to Damascus, where he meets Simon, and Simon touches him and restores his sight. But Saul is converted and becomes Paul. Then Saul becomes a student. We see this when we read on, when we see that he was called there in chapter 1, and we go on in verse 15, talks about the fact that he was called. Not only was he given life by Jesus when he was separated from his mother's womb, but also he was given spiritual life when he was saved and called by grace. And then given the ministry to preach the gospel, verse 16. And then he says in verse 17, I didn't go straight to Jerusalem. Now there's a lesson in here for us, and that's the fact that when God calls us something, that doesn't mean that necessarily a person gets saved and goes straight into preaching. Or straight into, I'm going to go straight into being First Baptist, whatever, Atlanta, or whatever it is. Saul went and received training. Now, the training wasn't by man. It wasn't in the seminary, other than if you want to say the seminary of Jesus Christ, because he was supernaturally trained by Christ in Arabia. How exactly, we don't know. Supernaturally, by vision, by supernatural whatever, but he was trained, given the training that he needed, not in the religion of Judaism, but in the gospel of Jesus, there for 3 years in Arabia. And then in chapter 9 of Acts, he begins, and we don't read a lot about this here, before he goes up to Jerusalem, he actually begins to minister in Damascus. And then he actually does go, eventually he does go, about 3 years after, so sometime around the same time, he goes and he's rejected really by the church. They're afraid, the early church leaders are afraid because all they know is this is Saul that was persecuting. But in that fear, along comes a man named Barnabas, and Barnabas takes him up and introduces him to Peter and to James, the brother of Jesus. And we read about this where he goes up and he does not meet. After 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, and both him 15 days. But other of the apostles I saw not, save James, the Lord's brother. And so therefore we're saying that he would, and if you go back to Acts, you find out that they were afraid to meet with him. But Barnabas came along and vouched for him and said, hey, he's been doing great things, teaching and preaching, and he's been called of God, and I want you to meet him, and he's on our side. He's on Christ's side. And so Saul then goes to Syria and Cilicia. We see that in verse 21. And he's there for nearly 10 years, ministering, preaching, but really kind of out of the limelight. He's not in the spotlight yet. He is yet to become Paul, the great missionary. Now, he's doing work for the Lord. He is serving the Lord. But kind of almost behind the scenes, if you will. He is serving the Lord. And then God has the church send him out on the first missionary journey, and he goes, and that's where he plants the church in Galatia. And Paul goes on 3 missionary journeys, and then later he's arrested, and he's taken to Rome. He's imprisoned for a while. Many of the prison epistles are written during that time. And then after that, he's released. And then eventually he's rearrested, and then he is beheaded. Acts chapter 28 doesn't tell us of the beheading. It ends with him there about to be in prison. But history tells us that he was then executed, probably around 65 years old. And so therefore, from his early 30s until 65, so let's say 30 years or so, he ministers for the Lord. The first half of his life, he was ministering to himself and to religion. But his path was not a straight one. His path was not an easy one. His path was not without curves and turns. In fact, when you read in the book of Acts, you find that he wanted to go one way, but the Lord prevented him and sent him another way. And my point is this: the road to the Lord is often a broken one, and the road after the Lord, salvation, if you will, is often a broken road. But here's the thing that I want you to see as we go forward. I'm not going to ask you to answer out loud, but I was talking to Mark earlier, and I was saying, think about this. When in the timeline compared to Jesus, did Paul live? Well, we know Paul's story is after Jesus died and rose again. We know that. But here's what you may not realize. You may know it, but you may not realize it. Paul, or Saul, was alive and lived in the days of Jesus. Meaning, Saul was probably not more than 5 years younger than Jesus. When we often think of Saul and the missionary journeys and Saul and his call, we often think of him being, well, at least in my mind, well after Jesus died. But it was not. It probably was 4 or 5 years after Jesus died and rose again that Saul, maybe as few as 3, that Saul is called to the gospel, or saved by the gospel and called by Jesus Christ, and begins his ministry. Here's my point. We often think, well, if I could have lived in the time of Jesus, it'd be different. Saul lived in the time of Jesus. Now, we have no record of Saul ever having met Jesus before the road to Damascus. However, if Saul was a young man in and around that area at that time, surely he would have heard about Jesus. And if you follow the timeline of when he started, he studied for about 3 years under Gamaliel, which was a famous rabbi around the time of the crucifixion of Jesus, you realize that Paul started really his zeal for Judaism, the religion of the Jews, at the time that Jesus died. And so logically thinking, and Paul, by the way, Saul, had great zeal for the law of Moses, for Judaism. And he would have looked at Jesus, again, we don't know what he knew or what he saw, but he was zealous for Judaism. He would have been opposed to Jesus completely, and you can't help but wonder if it was the Jesus ministry and then his crucifixion that kind of drove him into becoming a Pharisee, studying under Gamaliel. Because that would have happened right after Jesus died. And so here he is fighting for the law, what he believes is the true religion, what he believes is God's law. But at the same time, he's murdering people, he's imprisoning people, and he's doing all kinds of violence against the church because he thinks he's right. And so what I want you to see is this. I want you to see it was a broken road of Saul, but I think in the story of Saul becoming Paul in the broken road, we find this. Number 2, there is nobody on this broken road in life, this journey that we're on and everybody else is on too in this world in which we live, there is nobody outside the reach of the gospel. Nobody. And the reason I think that's important is because sometimes we get this idea of, well, that person there, they've had their chance, or that person there is never going to get saved, or that person there, they're just completely opposed to everything about church and everything about Christianity, and I'm not going to waste my time. That was Saul. Saul was the chief opposer of Jesus. Saul was the chief opposer of Christianity. Saul was the chief opposer of the gospel message. Saul was a person that was so convinced that he was right and Jesus was wrong, and the Christians, those of the way, which we call Christians now, were wrong. He was putting them in prison and killing them, but he said, I'm going to be more zealous than anybody else, and I'm going to be more ambitious than anybody else in my religion so that I can carry out the work of God. But it was wicked. It was evil. But Paul himself said, I was the chief of sinners. I was the worst of the worst. So if Saul can be saved and become Paul, there is nobody that is outside the reach of the gospel. You say, well, we know that. I know we know that, but I wonder if we really believe that. Like in our knowledge, we say, well, yeah, I understand that whosoever will may come, and I understand that it's for everybody. He loved the whole world. But as that person, as Joe down the street, or the gas station clerk, or whoever it might be, the Muslim, or the atheist, whoever it is, are they really in the reach of the gospel? And the answer is yes. If Jesus can save me, then Jesus can save anybody. If Jesus can save you, then Jesus can save anybody. But certainly you say, well, but I'm not that bad. Saul, if God can save him, God can save anybody. There is no one. He was the most vile and opposed to Christianity, the most vocal rejecter of Jesus. That was Saul. Murdering Christians, imprisoning believers, doing everything he could to put a stop to the church. That's what Saul was. But again, the other part of that is the fact that good and decent people also need Jesus. Because in Saul's mind, he was doing right. He was a righteous living man. He was following the law of God. He was doing the work of God, of Jehovah. That's what he was doing. By the way, we have those in other religions that are doing the work of their God, they believe, in opposing Christianity. Heard, again, a so-called pastor turned politician in Texas say this week that although I'm a Christian, I think it's completely wrong that we teach children about the gospel. He thinks he's doing right. He's a decent person. He's a moral person. But good and decent people, religious people, go to hell. But they're not outside the reach of Jesus. Paul was decent and moral. He was upright and religious. He was zealous to defend his faith, following what he believed was right. By the way, that ought to help us to understand that there are good and decent people that follow a different train of thought for a perfectly logical reason, but they still need Jesus. And so therefore we ought not to get the idea of, well, God's going to take care of them. They need Jesus. But I also want you to see this. People need a champion. In this story of Saul's broken road, I want you to see that people need a champion. When it talks about in verse 17 that he didn't go up to Jerusalem, he didn't go up because they wouldn't meet with him. He was being rejected. Now, before I get there, people need a champion, meaning people need Jesus. But you and I can be the champions of what I mean is this: the people that will champion Christ. The people that will tell them the truth and point them to Jesus. The people that will show them the love of God. Tell them of the love of God. Tell them of their need to love the love of God. Somebody needs somebody. When a house is burning down, this is often an illustration I use, and it's a good one. But if somebody is in a burning house, they need a hero to come in and tell them the house is on fire. This is the way out. Follow me. Jesus is the one that saves them, but they need someone to say, your house is on fire. When somebody's in a car wreck, they need someone to reach out and pull them out. People need someone to tell them the truth about Jesus. But in another way, they need a champion, and that in this story is Barnabas. Now, we don't read about Barnabas here. I'm simply going back to what Paul is talking about when he says, I didn't go up to Jerusalem, but then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem and saw Peter. That was because of Barnabas. People need someone to tell them about Jesus, but people also need someone to be an encourager and a leader and a mentor and help them along the way. And that's what Barnabas was in the early ministry of Paul. And there are those in this church that are Barnabases. They're encouragers. They're lifter-uppers. They're vouchers, if you will. And there are people here that are mentors. But I want to encourage us all to be like Barnabas and be a champion for people who will tell them, but also mentor and help them and lead them and encourage them. And God can use anyone, any one of us. God often uses the insignificant. We know this. Jesus was born of a virgin in a manger, a carpenter's son. Joseph being his physical dad, earthly father, if you will, not biological, but father figure, was a carpenter. Jesus used fishermen. Jesus used shepherds. Jesus used tax collectors. God used tax collectors. God used fishermen. God used shepherds. God used women. And while that doesn't seem so odd today, although there's some that want to argue about that, and they say, well, you're just, as Baptists, you're trying to say that women ought not to be used. No, women are wonderfully used of God. But Jesus was the one that pointed that out when women who were considered less than nothing, property, in those days, and they were the ones that first saw Jesus alive. They were the ones that first told the message that Jesus had risen. So God uses the insignificant according to man's eyes, but He can use anyone. And I hope that if you hear, and I'm sure you've heard before, that God wants to use you, but Paul teaches us a lesson in who God uses. And what I mean by that is this. We look at Paul and we say, well, he was educated, and certainly he was educated in religion, in the law. And then, of course, he was educated in a certain degree by Jesus himself, but he didn't have special degrees, if you will, from Jesus. It was simply a supernatural training. But Paul, scholars say, most likely was small in stature. It gives me hope. Saul probably had some physical problems. He talks about his bad eyesight. Also starting to give me some hope because I'm starting to have trouble seeing things farther and farther away. Yeah, just to give you an idea, I do have glasses. I don't wear them all the time, but I had to go and get my license renewed, not because it was time to renew my license, but Tracy said, you need to get your real ID. In order to get my real ID, I had to get some other stuff together, and I went in to get my real ID, and they said, I didn't know they were going to make me take a vision test again because I didn't have to renew my license for another 5 years or whatever. And so I went in, and he says, you got to take a vision test. I said, what? I said, I didn't even bring my glasses. And he goes, well, do you wear glasses? And I said, well, not all the time, but he said, well, here, put your head on this thing. He said, read these lines across the bottom. And I said, A, D, F, G, C, D, R, Q, Z, L, 3, 5. Guessing at half of them. And he said, what about the first one on the left? I said, what one's on the first and the left? I don't see anything on the left. He goes, yeah, you need your glasses. Had to go home and get my glasses. I didn't pass the test. But my point is this, my vision's getting worse. But Paul, if you looked at him, wasn't somebody that you'd say, wow. But Paul was used greatly of God. The usefulness that you have to Jesus, to God, to the gospel, is not based on looks or talent or ability or power or position or money. You ready for this? I believe this with all my heart. Your usefulness to God is not based on skill or education. It's not based on age or gender. It's based on your faithfulness to Him and your zeal and desire to follow Him. If you are faithful to God and you are passionate about obeying and following whatever His will is for you, you are useful to the Lord. Now, there's many Christians who struggle in their faithfulness. There's many Christians who struggle in their zeal. They can be used, but they're not because they're not faithful or they are complacent in their Christian life. That's just the reality. Doesn't mean you can't be used, but you're not going to be until you're faithful and have a zeal for the Lord. Paul, Mark and I were just talking about this morning. Paul was a zealous man for the law. And God took that zeal that he had for the law and changed him to be zealous for the gospel and for Christ. And the same passion, the same dedication, the same faithfulness he had to the law was now changed to the gospel. And Paul went on to write 2/3 of the New Testament and become the greatest missionary the world has ever seen and one of the greatest Christians that has ever lived. But it wasn't based on his nationality. It wasn't based on his citizenship. It wasn't based on his speaking ability or writing ability or teaching ability. It was based on his faithfulness and his zeal, and God did great things through him. And it was according to the will of the Lord. There are people that we look at like Paul and we say, man, what a ministry. And there are others that we look at. My mind goes to Jerry Savinsky, one of the greatest preachers I've ever heard, one of my favorite evangelists I've ever heard. But he doesn't have a well-known ministry. But God has used him greatly, but he doesn't have the sheer numbers that he can point to and say, this many people have come or this many people have been saved. But God has used him greatly. And my point is this, our vision or our idea or our perception of what is great is not what really matters. It's what God says is great. And what God says is great is your obedience to me and your service to me and doing it with a heart of love for me. And in my will, you'll be used for what my purposes are. The last thing I want you to see from this passage is Paul's destination never remained the same. And what I mean by that is this. His destination was a Pharisee. His destination was pursuing the Jews. His destination was Damascus on the way to get those of the way and take them into prison. But in his journey, Paul starts off, his home was Tarsus. He's then there for a while in Jerusalem. He then, when he gets saved, goes to Arabia, then back to Damascus, then to Syria and Cilicia. And then he goes on a missionary journey to Asia Minor, and then on to Rome, and plants churches and journeying on these mission journeys. And for a while he's free, and then for a while he's in prison. For a while he's young, and then he's old. But his desire for the Lord from the time that he met Jesus was the same. And his goal was to finish his race well, to finish the course well, to receive a well done, good and faithful servant. And so also ought ours to be. And the goal that we have is not that people would say, oh, isn't Preacher Jonathan wonderful? Or isn't Mark Bryson wonderful? Or isn't Eddie Maccabee wonderful? But when they look at you and they hear you and they meet you, they say, praise the name of God that is doing something through him. Look in the last verse. At first they were afraid, but then they hear that this one that used to persecute us now preaches the faith, which building up, which once he destroyed, and they glorified God in me. In other words, they glorified God because of what God did on the broken road with me. What God called you to is not necessarily what God will call you to. Where God has you now is not exactly where God will leave you now. You may have been whatever your occupation was. You may be wherever you're at now. But that doesn't mean that God won't change his direction for you. In other words, God has a will for you. Praise the Lord and serve him wherever you're at. But the specific will for you may change. And most likely is going to change. Whether it be your locale as far as where you live, whether it be your job and what you do. But if you're faithful to the Lord and zealous for him, you're going to do what Paul did and say, Lord, whatever it is that you have for me. God, I wanted to go this way, but you changed my direction, so therefore I'm going to go that way. That you're leading me. And you'll be sensitive to what the Lord has for you. Because your desire is for him. And it doesn't matter your age. People think, well, I'm done now, or I've served my time, or I did my time, or when I was a young man, I did this, and I went out and did that for the Lord, but now I'm old. Paul says later on, not right here, but he says, I'm old. I'm old. He said when Paul was 65 when he died, he said, well, that's not that old. Back then it was. Back then it was. People didn't live as long then as they do now. But my point is this. Are you willing for all the rest of your days to say to the Lord, Thy will be done. Your grace has called me, and I will follow the call that you put on my life. And will you go to people, no matter whether you think they deserve it, whether you think they're going to respond to it, whether you think they're in the reach or out of the reach, will you go and will you tell people about Jesus? Will you be an encourager, a mentor? God has a purpose for you. The road that He has you on is not straight and smooth, but it's often broken. But it's broken for a purpose. If Paul hadn't been on the broken road that he was on, Paul wouldn't have been to the place that he ended up being. Now, sometimes it's broken because we resist, and other times it's broken because that's the plan that God has for us as He carries us along the way. And sometimes we think, well, either my time is done or I've wasted my chance, or God could never use me. My friend, I'm here to tell you, God has a desire for your life. Now, the first desire for your life is to know Jesus Christ through salvation. But that's not the destination. That's the beginning of the road. It's a different road. You were on one road, headed one way, and then you got saved. Paul got saved, and he was put on a different highway, going a different direction. And so to you, you also were on a road, and if you've been saved, God has sent you on a different path, and now you are on a different journey. But God has, the destination is not the cross or salvation. Your final destination is a home in heaven. But until then, what will you do for Him? Will you say, yes, Lord, I'm willing to endure the broken road? Let's pray.